Japanese pension funds are targeting the Australian property market this year, with the latest data from Colliers showing Japanese capital in the first half jumped to $2.5 billion, and that's 11 times higher than the average. Joining me now is Chris Pilgrim, Managing Director of Global Capital Markets at Colliers for the Asia Pacific. Chris, thanks so much for your time. Why are Japanese investors so keen on the Australian property market right now?
Edward, hi there. Look, I think it's a really great question, and we've been looking at a lot of different capital sources, really from around the world. And as you know, Australia is consistently a top 10 global destination for capital. I think what we're seeing at the moment with some of the Japanese capital is really looking at those long-term thematics about Australia: population growth, economic growth, and I think really looking at that as a market for long-term growth. And we can obviously come into this as well, Edward, but I think also we're seeing it targeting various asset classes as well within the real estate sector. So it's really varied. But I think what we've seen historically is different pools of capital, but certainly strength from Japan right now.
Yeah, and globally, it looks like capital is being shifted out of Europe, the Middle East and Africa. Why are those areas becoming a bit unattractive right now to investors?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, again, from a real estate perspective, I mean, there are various headwinds which I think all markets have faced. But on the relative basis, Asia Pacific offers a real growth opportunity, both from an economic point of view, from a growth point of view, but also just in terms of asset class point of view. There's still emerging asset classes in real estate that investors are increasingly finding attractive to enter into from an early stage. And for example, that might be the build to rent sector in Australia, or the fact that Japan already has a very strong multifamily real estate asset class to invest in. And I think all those different fundamentals and obviously where various countries are at in terms of their interest rate environment, inflationary environment. But I think what's really been seen is not only is the strength of equity sitting in the Asia Pacific region, but also just a huge amount of opportunity to seek return and long-term investment as well.
Yeah, looking specifically at the Australian market with real estate, a lot of capital obviously flowing in. What are some of the really popular sectors that investors are looking at? Is apartments a growth sector still right now?
Yeah, I mean, Edward, we've seen, I think, in this since the beginning of 23, 39% of all overseas capital that's been deployed into Australia has gone into the living sector of some sort. And I think, we can really break that down. I think, for sure, apartments, there's always a strong, demand from overseas investors, more at a private level, perhaps for those individual apartments. But from an institutional investor base and a lot of the clients that we work with, I think we're really seeing that shift in terms of wanting to get into that broad living sector. But I think arguably for Australia, that really means the build-to-rent market, which again is very much about building stock into an institutional-grade residential investment sector, and following the trend that America's had for maybe 30 years, the UK's had for the last 5, and many parts of Europe as well. But I think we also can't underestimate the strength of the education system in Australia, and particularly for Asian capital, so regional capital within APAC, who often seek to have that English language university education in Australia. Again, we're seeing huge demand from that thematic in terms of what we call PBSA, but purpose-built student housing accommodation.
Yeah, Australia's population grew almost 2% last year, which is pretty strong compared to a lot of other OECD economies. Is that something that's really helping boost investment in the country?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when you're looking at the global sort of population environment at the moment, in terms of most countries entering into an aging population decline, but there's a few pockets, where there genuinely is, population growth through organic measures, but certainly through immigration as well. And I think, when we look at some of those dynamics, and perhaps Canada's another example, but Australia is absolutely at the forefront of that from a population dynamic. And I think, when we're speaking to institutional investors around the world, but certainly in the Asia region as well, I think when they're looking at those thematics of, where can you get a long-term investment, what makes sense, population growth generally means you need real estate. And that means across the board, whether more office space, more housing, more retail, more logistics. So it's, again, I think, from that point of view, that's where we're seeing demand from foreign capital coming into Australia, but it is very much against those thematics you mentioned.
Yeah, and just looking at those other sectors, corporate office, industrial warehousing, and then as well retail spaces, out of those, which one is holding up the best still?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, Edward. And I think, look, different investors have got different strategies and at different points in their own investment cycles. So I think what we're seeing is there's real opportunity in all those sectors, and particularly whether that's from an office sector moving to more of an ESG or green compliant asset, both from an occupier and an investor point of view. But I think, it would be hard not to highlight just the strength of the Australian logistics market. Our teams across Australia have had a very strong first half in this year as a transactional sector. We've seen over $500 million deployed just in the last quarter we've had in Q3, and that's on top of the 1.5 billion already transacted since the beginning of 2023. And I think where you see real depth in that sector as we're moving into Q4, there's another $2 billion worth of logistics assets either on the market or perhaps moving towards a transaction as well. So, certainly strength in logistics. And I'd say that's capital that's coming into Australia, not only domestically from the strength of your domestic investors, but again, thematically from a lot of institutional investors who are pivoting to an Asia Pacific strategy and very much starting in Australia with a logistics strategy as well.
Well, Chris Pilgrim from Colliers, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Edward, thanks very much for having me.